And I would like to say hello to our first speaker. Jennifer, can you say hello?
Absolutely, Ginger. Thank you so much for having me here today. What a pleasure to be with you all as a part of the Women's Leadership Summit. And so my name is Jennifer Krocza. I am the Vice President of Contracts and International Trade Compliance at Northrop Grumman's Defense Systems Sector. Ginger, were you trying to add something?
No, thank you so much. And yeah, just pull up your slides and take it away. The floor is all yours.
Hey, wonderful. I'm going to share my screen and you let me know if everyone can see the screen.
Yep, that looks wonderful.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today about imposter syndrome, how to recognize imposter syndrome and have some tools to counter self-doubt. Now, we talk about self-confidence and self-doubt, and they're really just moments for each of us, in my opinion. And a perfect example of that is actually the first time I was asked to speak about imposter syndrome. I had never heard of it before. And I have to laugh because the first thought that occurred to me was, why are they asking me to talk about this? Did they think I have imposter syndrome? That was my first reaction, was a reaction of self-doubt. But when we think about the imposter syndrome, I think this is something that's generally misunderstood. It is a phrase that was coined by a psychologist, but it's not a disease. It's a shared experience that many successful people have, where they often feel feelings of self-doubt or feel like they don't belong, despite ample evidence to the contrary with regard to their success. And so as I was asked to speak about imposter syndrome, I had to start researching it and try to understand what is this and how do I speak about it. And there are two things I found very helpful in understanding this that I wanted to share with you all today. The first, and I want to pause, is everybody able to see the screen here?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay. I didn't have the green box around it, so that's why I was trying to make sure that everybody could see it. The first thing I wanted to share was a TED Talk. Now, this happens to be an Australian TED Talk. So for those of you who may not recognize him, Mike Cannon-Brookes, you see here an excerpt from Forbes, worth about $13 billion, but he made his name because he is one of the two founders of the Atlassian suite of software. So if anybody knows Jira and Confluence, that is something he and his business partner created, and they actually started their company on credit cards right out of college. This TED Talk, we don't have an opportunity to share it here today. However, if you get a chance, the first 7 minutes, I think are particularly helpful to hear. And when Mike talks about imposter syndrome, he talks about his own experience and said, basically, hey, when I first came out of college, we started this company, knew nothing about how to start a business. Imagine trying to hire your first HR rep when you have never actually had experience working at a company or experience with what HR is. And he talks about as they went along and they were developing their business, their accountant recommended that they apply for the Entrepreneur of the Year award and in Australia. And so they applied locally. They didn't even show up for the event and they won. And then they went to the state level and they won. And then they went to the country level and they won. And all of a sudden he finds himself at the World Entrepreneur Awards. And he jokes in this interview, he talks about after a few glasses of wine, sharing with the person next to him that he didn't feel like he belonged in this room. He was waiting for somebody to recognize that here's just a kid out of college and he doesn't belong there. And the other person, who happened to be the CEO of a company, about 30,000 employees, said he felt exactly the same way. And so I appreciate how he talks about this particular syndrome because it highlights we often make assumptions that we're the only ones feeling out of our depth. We're the only ones who are having those moments of self-doubt, and it's really common amongst successful individuals. And that leads me to the second thing I found helpful in researching this topic. It was an article and a book, ultimately by Valerie Young. And she categorized imposter syndromes into 5 different types, or if you will, 5 different categories. And I wanted to take a second to talk about each of those with you here today. Now, here's my official caveat, being the good contract person that I am. You will not find, I think, as you look at these, that 100% of all the traits or the questions apply to you, but you might find that you resonate with pieces of different ones, or at least that was my personal experience. And so when I looked at each of these 5, a couple of them resonated with me more strongly. The 5 categories we're going to talk about are the perfectionist, the superwoman or superman, the natural genius, the rugged individualist, and the expert. What's a perfectionist? Well, in this particular case, she defines a perfectionist as somebody who sets excessively high goals for themselves. When they fail to reach a goal, they may experience self-doubt or, worry that they're not measuring up. And can feel like if they want something done right, they have to do it themselves. Well, I'll talk about again myself from a firsthand experience, because my experience is a little bit different. I resonate with this category, but I would not consider myself a perfectionist. And yet when I looked at it through the lens of the imposter syndrome, I reflect on something a peer once told me. A peer once told me that the difference between people who are high performing and maybe less so, and I think it was a kind way of calling me a perfectionist, said your expectations for doing the job are here, where somebody else's expectations may be here. So for me, it feels like doing the bare minimum, but there's a difference between what I perceive as an acceptable minimum and somebody else's. So when you think about it, when you think about this, that's a series of traits, and then underneath are questions you can ask yourself. So, hey, if you miss the high mark on something, do you think to yourself, you're not cut out for it, or you ruminate on it for days? Well, I generally don't think myself that I'm not cut out for it, but I'll tell you, I can ruminate on a bad event or a bad meeting for years. I can often contemplate that for a very long period of time. And so you have that memory of it that goes on for a period of time. I won't read each of these, but they're examples that you can see when you look across each of the topics. Looking at the Superman or Superwoman. I think different individuals, again, may experience in different ways, but do you feel like a phony among real deal colleagues, push yourself to work harder, or frankly, just work so much that maybe your personal relationships or your hobbies will be taking a back seat? And that's a danger for us all, I think, especially when you're in a high-performing organization or a very demanding job, is are you finding the time to get the balance? Because it is easy to be stressed and not able to take time for yourself. So when you think about some of these questions, a few examples of what a Superman or Superwoman might look like in this case. Moving to the natural genius. The example I have of the natural genius is actually somebody I think of like my daughter, who has many things that have just come easy to her. She doesn't even have to try at certain things. And when she hits something that is hard for her, where she is not immediately successful, she has a lot of self-doubt. She questions herself. And that's an example here when you think about this category is, are you used to excelling without much effort? Do you have a track record of being that straight A student or being considered a top performer in anything you do, so that when you're not and you have a moment where maybe it wasn't perfect, you really experience that self-doubt? The rugged individualist. Rugged individualists may feel like asking for help makes them feel weak or like a phony, but they are supposed to be the person that has all the answers, need to do it on their own, accomplish it on their own. And so, they take it on, and asking for help can be viewed as a weakness. And then moving to the expert. The expert is the fifth category that we'll talk about here today. It's that underlying fear of being viewed as inexperienced or unknowledgeable. Can you demonstrate a tendency to seek out information? And really, you could get into analysis paralysis because you want to have all the information. Or, I like this last line, it may feel like somehow you tricked your employer into hiring them. And so I'll give you another example here because this one also resonates with me. I remember being asked to take on a position I had no experience for. And I had gone into the meeting knowing that they were going to offer me a position outside of any experience I had. And I was ready to absolutely say no. I was not going to accept this position. And I did one thing that turns out in hindsight to be a very good question to have asked. I asked them, why are you thinking of me for this position? And the answer they gave in this particular case made me say yes. They said, listen, we don't need you to be the subject matter expert. We need someone who can step in and provide leadership. And quite frankly, we need somebody who can reach outside this team's experience base and bring in best practices from other parts of the corporation. And when they said that, it clicked for me that they were not looking for me to truly be the expert. And I actually said during the meeting, so we're clear, I know nothing. And they said, yes, we are very clear that you don't have expertise in this particular area. Well, it was a very freeing moment for me. But in hindsight, when I look at these questions, I absolutely was ready to walk away from this opportunity because I didn't think I met the job requirements. Turns out I didn't understand what they were looking for. But I was very quick to dismiss something because of that fear of not being the person with the answers. I was used to having deep subject matter expertise, and it was very uncomfortable for me to step into an area where I had none. But when we got to a clear agreement that I was not expected to be the expert, it was empowering me to do those two things they asked, truly listen to the expertise on my team and reach out for other best practices and frankly learn. And it was one of the best decisions I ever made in my career. So I shared that story with you because I would have walked away from it without giving it another thought had I not asked that particular question. And it's because of several of the things you see here on the list. So now that you've heard a little bit about what imposter syndrome can be from a couple of different perspectives, both the example of Mike Cannon-Brookes and this article and book, which give different types of imposter syndrome tendencies, I wanted to share with you all a few things that I have found to be helpful in trying to counter imposter syndrome. And so we called it RAC. So just something that myself and a friend had made up was just an acronym to remember. And the first letter in RAC was R. R was for recalibrate. And the first here was recalibrate expectations. And here in the first sub-bullet, you can see me letting go of my perfectionist tendencies because I have a typo in this first bullet. we'll accept it and learn that we don't have to be perfect here, because what I was trying to say in this bullet, and clearly I was interrupted somewhere along the way, was there are some tasks which require perfection. And sometimes we can be directionally accurate. Sometimes getting the gist or having the right context is sufficient. And I think one of the things we all can do is really pause and make sure we're thinking about, does this task require perfection, or does it require me to be directionally accurate? Because back in high school, a 90% was an A. And especially as you grow in leadership positions, you're not going to be able to be perfect on everything. So choosing your failures, understanding which balls can bounce, which balls will break when they hit the floor, is an important part of deciding how to split your time. And so allowing yourself to be imperfect, take the mistakes in stride, and really think about how you are defining success for any given role. Like the example I shared with you, I started off when I was offered this position, not this one, but the one I was talking about, defining that position as I was going to fail because I didn't have subject matter expertise. Once we redefined that role to say they needed leadership and someone to gather best practices, I had a totally different perspective on the role and my definition of success. And then lastly here, when you, instead of beating yourself up when you don't meet impossibly high standards, really think about the specific changeable behaviors you can improve over time. If you make a mistake on a chart or in a briefing, what can you learn from it? How do you apply that? I also highlighted here, I think it's important to be realistic in your preparations, because that's one of the places I think people can feel like a failure is, do you have the answer to every question? Now, I want to be careful. Particularly in executive leadership, you should anticipate questions, right? We should be as prepared as possible. But if you are asked a question that you don't know the answer to, then being willing to say you don't know and you will take the action is usually acceptable. And I will say, I think it's an opportunity to demonstrate that you can take the action, close it, build credibility, and demonstrate that you are resourceful in getting to the answers. It's very difficult to have the answer to every question. In most cases, we're measured by whether we can get to the answers. The second letter in our acronym here, A, is for avoid. And so as we think about tools to counter self-doubt, we want to avoid overworking on a consistent basis. Now that's a balancing act. I will tell you, I have never worked more hours in my life than I do at the moment, but I've also got a lot of control over defining what works for both me and for my family. And that is, I think, the art form of many of these positions, is you have to draw boundaries around what's important to be successful, both at work and at home. I have been married for 25 years. I have 2 teenage daughters. And while there were things happening at work this weekend, it was also homecoming. And so I was not working all weekend. I absolutely was focused on ensuring my daughters had a memorable experience as a part of homecoming. We took the pictures. We had the friends over to the house. It is picking those times to make sure you are finding the balance. Secondly, I think it's really important to prioritize time. And so I often find that people can spend a lot of time working without actually accomplishing anything. And so really trying to ensure that you are prioritizing the top 5 things that you need to move the needle on. Because you can spend all day doing tasks and not getting results. Similarly, especially in times where it's busy, own your own to-do list. I'm the type of person that you could stop giving me assignments tomorrow and I'd keep running for another 6 weeks or 2 months, because I'm hardwired to try to improve things, to make things better. And so nobody has to assign things to me for me to find things to do. And I have to make sure that when I'm working on things, I'm making smart decisions on where to spend my time. Because there's a lot of things I could do. I need to make sure I'm doing the things I must do. And then truly, of course, with you and your teams, right, when everything's an emergency, nothing is an emergency. So being very thoughtful around that, I think, is important as well. When we move to the next C, C here is for control, controlling your thoughts, actively considering your inner monologue. And I think many of us have an internal monologue. It's like the picture I showed on the very first chart, right? A lot of positives, one negative we can focus. We're hardwired in many cases to focus on the negative. And I think we have to be very intentional in recognizing when we are hyper-focusing on the negative and tuning out the positive. So one of the things I would offer as a suggestion is make sure you're developing data sources. Whose feedback are you listening to? And are you really listening to balanced feedback? Because it's easy to focus on the negative, but that may not represent all the feedback that's really relevant for you to understand. And so I often recommend people develop trusted mentors, somebody you can ask for feedback and be open with and take it personally. I would go into meetings and I had a peer. She and I would set the expectation with one another before the meeting. Give me feedback when you're done. And she would come back at the end of the meeting, said, you did great on these 3 points. You had 16 ums as a part of the presentation. You stumbled here. You could have done better on this point. And I will tell you, I grew so much from her being willing to offer that transparent, honest feedback. Our last C here is celebrate. Truly, when you think about all the ways to counter self-doubt, celebrating the victories, those small successes and big ones, is a really important part of, I think, our own personal journey. Don't just rely on external validation, practice internal validation, and truly celebrate your own personal victories, because you're probably the only one who knows what it took to accomplish it. And so with that, I will just say confidence truly is like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. Know that. I think we're all in good company. Most successful people I have met have moments where they experience self-doubt and moments where they feel confident. And I think that's a part of the natural experience. But it helps, I think, to hear other people talk openly about it, to realize you're not alone, to realize you're not the only one who might have those moments of self-doubt. So I've left in this package references in case anybody wanted to go back and look at the details and the research that is behind our discussion today. And with that, I'll pause and turn it back to you, Ginger, for any questions.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And yes, just as a reminder, if someone would like to ask a live question, you can raise your hand in Zoom and I can unmute you. But we have questions that have come in through our chat before we move along to our panel. And Anna says, I'm new to my company and I was onboarded remotely. Learn to develop trust in those friendships to ask for feedback.
Oh, it's such a great question. And obviously everyone's situation is a little bit different, but I will share with you some feedback I got from one of my own mentors. And it was something that was a little bit surprising to me, because I was asking about how to grow and how she had developed peer relationships. And she gave me a really great tip. She said, there are many times she will ask for another person's perspective or their help, even though she may not need it. She's, of course, always genuine. She would value it. She may not need it, but she wants to open the door up to create a relationship between the two parties. And so she leads by being vulnerable herself, asking someone else for help. asking for their feedback as a way to start building a relationship between two parties. And I thought that was a really interesting technique, because I think I myself wouldn't have thought to do that and ask for help for the purposes of building the relationship to allow for that feedback exchange in the future or developing a closer bond with somebody. So I thought it was a really great tip, and I share that one with you. You might ask someone for help, even if you don't actually need it, to try and build the relationship.
Well, thank you. I think we have time for 2 more questions before we move on to our panel. So for this next question, Bailey says, was there a time when you felt you crossed the confidence bridge? Was there a time you felt that you crossed the confidence bridge? I'm not there yet.
You know what? It probably varies hour by hour for me. I can have a great meeting and walk away feeling wonderful. And the next meeting, something goes wrong and I'm kicking myself and thinking about it for 3 weeks. And so the reality is, that's how I believe I'm wired. I tend to be very self-critical of what has gone well and what has not gone well. And that's why I try to focus it to say, what can I learn from it? Because I will never feel 100% confident in everything I do. I think the secret, though, is learning that as you grow as a leader, they don't expect us to have all the answers. You're typically dealing with more complex situations, less perfect information, more room for ambiguity or doubt. And so it can often be harder to be confident. I think you learn to trust your own judgment, to figure out how to ask questions in a smart way and try and get information and feedback. And then you make your best decision based off of that. And that you may not feel wholly confident at the end of that. But if you find you've made a bad decision, you can quickly make a different decision in most cases if you find out that's wrong. So I'd say get comfortable being less comfortable. That is okay to do. Learn what you can as you go along. And, when in doubt, try and learn from the experience.
Very well said. All right, well, I think this will be our final question, and then I'll ask you just for some final thoughts before we go to our panel. And Antoinette says, I struggle with being confident, and people see me as threatening. There's a difference, but overly confident people are often negatively labeled. Have you ever felt that way?
You know what? I think it's a really difficult line to walk sometimes, because it can really be about some of the other people and not always about you. What I have tried to do in those situations is, instead of, if I'm reading the dynamics that it's that type of situation, I will ask more questions and try to pull their opinion out so I better understand their perspective, rather than necessarily leading with an answer or a challenge, because I'm trying to find the middle ground and see if I can understand their position better. So hopefully that will help you in some of the dynamics you're dealing with, because I know they can be complex.
Well, thank you. So before we move on to our panel, do you have any final words of wisdom for all of our viewers today?
I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I would just say, final words of wisdom: you are not alone. I think we all struggle with confidence at different points in time, and try to look at, where you can focus on the positive and use that rack list of tools to help you. Thank you so much, Ginger.
Thank you so much for your time today.